Good afternoon. On behalf of the Montessori Foundation, welcome to our Wednesday Montessori Leadership Institute. We offer free webinars every Wednesday afternoon at 1 p.m. Eastern, and I know we have people logged in from all over the country and all over the world today. My name is Kathy Leach, and I am a consultant with the Montessori Foundation as well as head of school at Renaissance Montessori School, and involved in teacher training and some accreditation work and a few other things like that. I'm joined today, as I have been recently, and I appreciate it, by Jon Wolff, who also is a Montessori consultant, school leader, and teacher training, and specifically administrative and leadership training as well. So, Jon, welcome today. This is Jon's very busy season, doing lots of back-to-school consulting and back-to-school workshops. And in fact, one starts this evening, as far as I remember. And the title of that, Jon, if you can help us with the one that's the three-part series you have coming up tonight.
Series sponsored by the foundation. I'll try to get it right here. What are your school's New Year, in quotes, resolutions, helping teachers to set practice, people, and event development goals, having teachers look at the new year through new eyes and set some goals for improvement, and how school leaders can help teachers do that. Absolutely
wonderful. One of the things I say, we're blessed to be in education because we get 2 New Years every year. We get to start.
They will begin at 7 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, and it will continue next Wednesday, same time, the 9th, and we'll follow up with the 3rd session on the 16th. Same time.
Perfect. And how long do those sessions last?
About an hour and a half with questions. Sometimes they go 2 hours. We don't cut off people's work period.
Awesome. Wonderful. So we'll look forward to that, and if anyone who's listening in is still interested in signing up for that, please go to the Montessori Foundation website, and I'm sure you can have access to the program. There's also been a series of emails that have gone out, and if you're on this call, you're on that list, and so you can check your emails as well. So, Jon, today we have a different topic, or this afternoon we have a different topic that's we hope is going to be very helpful to our school leaders and educators that are participating with us today. So maybe you can introduce that topic, and I will get the screen ready for you.
Thanks so much, Kathy. Always appreciate your introduction. So I've been thinking about this for several years, and people ask me, so how do we help teachers create a normalized class as soon as possible? Community settled in, students as self-regulating and self-initiating as possible, so there can be really high-level learning and high-level teaching as soon as possible. So I have an introductory question for you to see if you observe this. I observed this in my own classroom when I was teaching in schools that I coordinated, and I see it a lot in my consulting work. So there's an influx at all levels in August, whenever your school begins, or after Labor Day, whatever your schedule is, an influx of lots of grace and courtesy lessons, lots of community meeting discussions about social norms, how we're going to support each other, how we're going to be respectful and responsible. It's like the garden is really planted with a lot of ground rule seeds. You probably see this. But if you return to that classroom in perhaps November or even late October, you don't see nearly as many presentations in the area of grace and courtesy or community meetings that deal with social norms at the older students level. And at the same time, with this lower amount or lower rate of grace and courtesy, teachers begin to complain about, why aren't students concentrating? Why are they disturbing others? Why aren't they not treating the materials with more care? Why are they not taking care of their environment, their classroom community? So many teachers, and again, I did this, I'm not pointing any fingers, they don't draw a relationship between the decrease in a focus on practical life, well, grace and courtesy is practical life, a focus or less of a focus on grace and courtesy, and the fact that students' self-regulation and behavior is beginning to go astray. So what we're going to look at here is not only how to plant the seeds, using a gardening analogy, early on of grace and courtesy to establish a real base of support, respect, responsibility, but how that garden needs to be tended and cultivated throughout the school year. So that's where we're going, Kathy. If we could go to the next slide.
Indeed we can.
Thank you.
There we go.
Okay. So to follow my dear friend Michael Dorr, the deep well of time, I thought we should begin with a story. The sad story of the tomato gardener. I'm going to read this because I haven't committed it with memory even though I wrote it. Once upon a time, there lived a gardener who desired to grow the largest, sweetest, most resilient, exquisitely shaped tomatoes in all the world. But to everyone's dismay, he seemed more focused on eliminating the pesky weeds and bugs and bunnies that kept popping up, dropping by, and hopping about the soil of his garden plot than on sowing the seeds of the tomatoes he wished to grow. The gardener became so obsessed with beating back these persistent pests that he forgot to prepare the soil of his garden beds with mulch, fertilizer, and water. Eventually, the impassioned gardener was able to rid his plot of every harmful growth and creature, at least for a while. But to his consternation, he observed not one tomato vine emerging from his garden. At last, it dawned on him that spending all of his time weeding and impeding these unwanted interlopers would still not produce the perfect tomatoes of his dreams. And so he began to sow the seeds of the tomato plants he wished to cultivate. But once again, the gardener worked so intently, hour upon hour, day after day, uprooting weeds, exterminating bugs, and fending off rabbits, that he failed to nurture the infant vines as they struggled to sprout and rise. In the end, the poor gardener was left with row upon row of small, tart tomatoes that rapidly ripened to a watery mush. The end. The analogy here is I see a lot of teachers, a lot of really excellent Montessori guides from the very beginning of the school year and into the school year redirecting wayward behavior. Behavior that's not engaged in the prepared environment, not engaged in independent work. Behavior that's distracting those who want to be engaged or are engaged. Behavior that's distracting teachers' lessons. Behavior that is not treating the materials with care or is not purposeful learning. Lots of reminders and redirections. Perfectly fine. It's usually done very respectfully. But I would submit to you that redirecting behavior, which is a necessary classroom management strategy, is akin to weeding a garden. It's already redirecting pesky and pesky behaviors. Seed planting is like the tomato analogy. Seed planting is doing grace and courtesy lessons. It's preventive medicine, and it should go on early and often and throughout the school year, and that's really what we're going to look at. Kathy? We're going to take a look at a few principles that this discussion is based upon, and then I'd love to get some of your thoughts. Principle 1, with regard to the development of social norms, grace and courtesy agreements, behavior guidelines, all the euphemisms for the same thing, teacher modeling is more important than even the formal grace and courtesy lessons, which is still much more important than incessant verbal reminders. So I want to ask you, have you observed among your teachers, or if you are a Montessori guide, have you observed within your own classroom practices a tendency after a while to remind children on the fly? Give you an example of things that I not only saw in my classroom when I was teaching, but I often see as a consultant when I'm doing classroom observations. So I'm a Montessori guide, and I'm on my way to give Kathy Leach a lesson in something. And on my way, I notice another child, little Tim Selden, who has not set his work up properly. He has perhaps the units on the left side rather than on the right side, and he's got the 1,000 cards over on the right side rather than on the left side. and I'm in a hurry. I want to get to Kathy, and I want to give a lesson. And as I pass by Tim, I interrupt his conversation by saying, Tim, remember to put those units on the right side. Do we have a ground rule in our classroom that students, ideally are not to interrupt the engagement or the concentration of other students? Or I might actually reach in without giving little Tim any kind of a warning and simply adjust the cards to have them set up in the proper sequence. Again, I am not modeling the very grace and courtesy that we have presented, or in this case that I've presented to the children. We try not to disturb people's concentration, and we also try to not reach in and disturb people's, work with people's materials or touch people's materials unless we ask them for permission. We need to walk that. So teacher modeling comes first, grace and courtesy lessons, as few reminders as you possibly can, or as few redirections. So I'd like you to do a little assessment. I believe that when it comes to modeling the grace and courtesies, the social norms that we want, we should be modeling it as teachers 100% of the time. And if we're not, I think we need to be conscious of that. What I used to do with my co-teacher or classroom assistant is I would let her know if my voice is getting too loud because I'm getting excited about something, or I'm beginning to project across several children to talk to some other children, thus interrupting children or disturbing them, I asked my assistant to give me a little hand signal. Bring it down, John, quiet it. So modeling of the teacher, by the teacher, of grace and courtesy agreements is 100%. I believe grace and courtesy lessons, or with older students, community discussions, which can also include grace and courtesy role plays, that should happen, I believe, every day in some circle time or community meeting. And yes, do we need to redirect traffic? Absolutely. But I would keep an eye on, in your own classroom and among your teachers, if you're an instructional leader, watch to see the balance between consistent teacher modeling, fairly routine grace and courtesy lessons, role plays, discussions, exercises, and the redirection of behavior. It should not be weighted toward redirection of behavior. I've been pontificating for already 5 minutes. Any thoughts or questions from our participants? I know there's a lot of wisdom out there.
Yeah, we'll give people a few minutes to go ahead and add something into the question box. And in the meantime, John, one of the things I think is important to tag on to what you've been saying, giving these grace and courtesy lessons, of course, is essential, and modeling, as you say, is the most powerful of all. What I find is that what you're referring to as the incessant verbal reminders, the children really tune it out. And what I notice is that it's sort of like similar to the tomato analogy again, that we're blocking the light, and the light to me are the students that will step up and help with that redirection, the students who will step up and guide the other students, and that the more we are imposing our redirection, particularly verbally, that inhibits them from having that opportunity to share with their peers.
Absolutely. No, I think that's really wise. I love that you brought in the concept of, again, whose community is this? Whose environment is this? Whose materials are these? And I think if the teacher is the sole sheriff in town, presenting grace and courtesies, facilitating community meetings on social norms, redirecting behavior, then we have not truly empowered the students to become more independent and interdependent. It's a sign, again, that the classroom is sort of based on the teacher's will, and the self-discipline and self-regulation have not become internalized. So I couldn't agree with your point more, Kathy. I'd like to add one other thing. In addition to kids tuning out teachers who are reminding them, yapping at them, threatening them, you're not going to be able to do this if you don't finish that work, they will tune us out, but it also becomes somewhat of a power struggle. It kind of can become a real game. It now creates an adversarial relationship between the authority figure and the student, which is frankly traditional education in Montessori, we are the guide on the side, we are not the sage on the stage. And so I think verbal reminders are actually moving us toward a more traditional paradigm of teacher direction rather than student empowerment.
Absolutely.
Any thoughts, Kathy?
Well, Michelle just says wonderful reminder, so she's appreciating. That's Michelle Jesse. Thanks for sharing. And we don't have any other questions at this point, but I do want to remind everyone that we do appreciate your comments and questions, and we will keep monitoring those and interject where we can. So please go ahead and add your thoughts and questions in the box. And Jon, we'll go ahead if you're ready for the next slide.
And thank you, Kathy. Principle 2 in this discussion. A spark of imagination is more transformative than 1,000 remonstrations. And it's the same gardening analogy. Sparking students with an imaginative what-if story is really more powerful in having them understand in a context why this behavior is more respectful, responsible, supportive, compassionate. When we redirect wayward behavior, which again needs to happen, we're really not sparking imagination in context. Let me share a couple stories with you. One in particular, and I think some of you have seen this, it's actually one of the publications on my publications list on my website. It's called The Story of the Three Roses. I beg your indulgence if you've heard this many times, but this was a very singular experience. In my first primary classroom in Philadelphia, 3 to 6-year-olds, a children's house, it was a rather socially schizophrenic class. What do I mean by that? Half of the children were bulls in china shops. It's like, oh, sorry, I didn't see your materials. Sorry, I didn't see your hand. It's like, don't you know there are other people in the universe? The other half was just the opposite. They were kind of like doormats. It's okay, you can step on my materials whenever you want to. So I had a group of children who, one, didn't know how to honor or notice the boundaries that they were stepping across, and the other group didn't know how to advocate and set boundaries like, look, it's not right for you to touch my materials. They didn't know how to do that. One group was too aggressive, one group was too passive. So I'm thinking, okay, these are 3 to 6-year-olds. I can't give them a discussion in modern psychology about boundary setting and how that's healthy for relationships. So I'm kind of pulling my hair out. And finally, I don't know where it came from, this story dawned on me. You'll need to use your imagination because this is an object lesson. I brought in 3 roses, each of different colors. And I said these 3 roses lived in a meadow on a mountaintop. The yellow rose, the red rose, the white rose. And they loved their life, and they all wanted the same thing in their life. They wanted to be loved by all the animals that lived on the mountain, and they wanted to be respected by all the animals. What do I mean? They never wanted their bodies to be hurt, and they never wanted their feelings to be hurt. Each of the roses decided to try to get love and respect from the animals in 3 different ways. The first rose did this, and I picked this rose up and I peeled the thorns off. And the children could see this, and then I passed the rose around so they could have a sensorial experience. This rose, the white rose, thought, if I have no thorns, then nobody will hurt me. Everybody will love me because I can't hurt any of the animals. This worked really well. Everybody loved the thornless, peaceful white rose until 2 animals called gophers came along. Now, if you're not familiar with gophers, gophers tend to eat the stems and the roots of certain plants, including roses. It's their food. The gophers started to nibble on the stem of the white thornless rose, and the rose started to cry and say, why are you hurting me? I respect you. I took my thorns off. Why are you hurting me? And the gopher said, sorry, you are part of our food chain. This is food we eat. So the first rose did not get the love and respect she had hoped for. Her body and her feelings were definitely hurt. The second rose, to win love and respect, did something completely different. At that point, I turned the rose upside down and hide the blossom in my hands and simply present the thorns. I've got thorns. Nobody's going to disrespect me because I've got thorns. All the animals looked at the second rose, the red rose, and thought, wow, That's pretty scary. If we get close to that rose, we could really be hurt. So the red rose had respect. Nobody hurt his body or her body, but she really had no friends, no love at all, because none of the animals wanted to get close to her because they were pretty afraid they were going to get stuck on her thorns. The yellow rose did something completely different to win love and respect. The yellow rose presented her beautiful blossom to the world, to all the animals. Be my friend, come and look at the beauty of my blossom. Touch the petals gently, smell the fragrance. And I actually passed the yellow rose around at that point for the children. Actually, I held it so they didn't get stuck with the thorns. And this worked really well. All the animals loved the yellow rose and respected the yellow rose until who came along one day? Yup, the gophers. And you can see, children, there's a space between this thorn and that thorn, and the gophers saw that. So they thought, we can eat between the thorns, let's have breakfast. And they opened their mouths to chew on the stem of the yellow rose, and the yellow rose went like this, and I turned the stem up in the presentation. No, you may not hurt my body, you must respect me, otherwise you might have to deal with my thorns. I really don't want to hurt you. I'd like to share my friendship, my beautiful flower. Do you understand you may not hurt me? The gophers were not particularly good listeners. They had never gone to a Montessori school. And so they continued to try to chew on the yellow rose's stem, and they cut their lips because of her thorns. And she apologized. She said, I'm so sorry. I didn't want to hurt you, but you may not disrespect me. Do you understand? And the gophers said, yes, we understand. And from that day, the yellow rose had love and respect because she offered her beautiful, lovely flower, but she could also say, no, you may not disrespect my body or my feelings. And that's the story of the 3 wild roses. So this story resonated with the souls of these children. It just met their social, emotional, moral needs. I did not explain the metaphor. With young children, you don't do the moral. They can just get the metaphor. These children asked me for this story about 30 straight days till I thought I was going to throw up. It was like, wow. Not the rose story again. You know, first plane of development, children love to repeat. It's process learning. But one day, after about a month out, I heard a child in the playground, a 4-year-old, turn to a 3-year-old and say, Kathy, you're behaving like the thorny red rose. Why don't you chill out and be more peaceful? They were actually starting to use the metaphor to monitor each other's behavior. So I'm bringing this up because imagination through storytelling and role-playing, which we'll get into in a bit, is actually more powerful than constant, reminders or redirections, which again we have to do, but that doesn't spark the imagination. It doesn't put the new behavior in the context of a story. It's simply sort of managing what's going on. Okay.
So, Jon, I love those stories. Of course, I've been using your object lessons for many, many years, and so I of course, remember that particular story. I also have a few comments here if you have a moment now. Well, so somebody says, let's say it's Elaine Klein Mills, says, love these stories. Did you say there was a place we could get a copy? And I think you referred to your website.
Yeah. Thank you, Kathy. If you go to Jonathan Wolff, that's WOLFF, and Jonathan, JONATHAN, WOLFF.org. There is a publications list, and you'll see some of the stories, including the 3 wild roses, and you can order them. I have started to PDF them, and I think the 3 wild roses is now a PDF orderable. You can do it electronically. The rest of them I usually send out by mail, but I'm converting everything on the website to make it more accessible for everyone.
That's great, and there's so many stories. I'll put a plug in for it because they're so helpful. With elementary students as well. And I have a couple more questions. So Christine Glover asked, going back to the example with the units and thousands in the incorrect position, remember little Timmy, he wasn't doing it properly?
I remember little Timmy.
And so refraining from interrupting, what would be the appropriate way to correct? Represent later?
The way I was trained, my dear mentor mother Isabel, who was trained by Dr. Montessori, one of my great gifts in life, she said that Dr. Montessori said that unless the child is being disrespectful or dangerous to the materials themselves or others, you don't interrupt a child's engagement concentration, at least initially, because concentration was Montessori's great discovery. When the brain is engaged, it's taking in things which we cannot even imagine. So as a good Montessori observer, hopefully we all are, we watch to see when there is a break in the child's focus. And usually if you look at children working of all ages, they're not, you know, 4 minutes at a time. Eventually they look around or they stop for a moment or talk to their friend. When you see a break in the child's engagement, then that's the time to step in and go, Kathy, or in this case, Tim, there's something I'd like to show you. Watch this. And you do a representation. You don't draw the child's attention to the mistake or the failure. That's, you know, it's not the units go on the right side. It's like, watch what I do. Watch where I put the units and the thousands and the hundreds and the tens. And you actually do a demonstration. But you wait for a little break, if at all possible.
Yep. Yep, and sometimes you can see, sometimes the child will self-correct, and so we want to observe for that to happen as well.
And Kathy, back to your really excellent point about empowering other students to support students, whether it's in behavior or academic, if you've done some grace and courtesy lessons on how to notice a friend who needs help and how to balance jumping up and helping somebody with getting your own work done, that's a whole other role play and discussion. And then teaching children how, in a very supportive and positive way, like a Montessori teacher giving a representation, how to offer help in a supportive way. If you've created a culture of coaching and mentoring that maintains a balance between helping and being responsible for your own work, and you've also taught the children how to offer help in a kind and respectful way, then you're going to have children stopping and going, you know, the units usually go on that side. May I show you how I set it up? And so you've now taken it out of the teacher's hands, and the students are collaboratively empowered. It was exactly Kathy's point a few minutes ago.
Yeah. And there's so many examples of that. And Megan Smith has a comment here. Don't you think this tendency to move through the room correcting is the mistaken fear that when children make mistakes and we don't correct them, that they will always think it's okay to do it that way, losing the faith that children will figure things out in their own time? So Megan, I think you hit it right on the head what we're talking about here.
Couldn't have said it better. And I think there's some things going on there, Megan, in addition to, you know, what you mentioned. Many children, at least the entire first plane of development up to 6, and I think it also moves into the second plane, the 6 to 9s, they are not product-oriented learners like us. We want the child to set up the bank game correctly and to do the bank game correctly. And is that the goal? Of course. But young children are more into the process of discovery of the experience, leading to, yes, to more of a mastery. But when we superimpose, the child's not doing it right, and I want them to do it right so they can get the benefits of addition dynamic, then we've missed the point. We're superimposing product orientation over the child's joy. And I think, frankly, when we do too much of that, we take the enjoyment out of the materials. We take the discovery away from the child. So now classrooms that sort of function on teachers overcorrecting children to master the material at the teacher's pace, there isn't a lot of self-motivated inquiry, or there's a lot less motivation and exploration because it becomes the teacher's agenda and not the agenda of the children to discover things and support each other in those discoveries. So.
And it really is a very subtle thing, John, to look at you might be observing a classroom and think it's a fully functional classroom until you really pay attention. Those children are watching and waiting for adults to let them know if they're doing it correctly or not. And you can see the culture of the class if you really tune into it.
If you're an instructional leader listening in and you want to do a test, this goes to Kathy's point, to see if students are really normalized, really self-directed, really self-regulating, really self-empowered, observe the classroom, if you can, when the teacher is absent for the day or has to take an emergency phone call. And you will see immediately whether it's the teacher's will and charisma that's holding that class together that looks so good, but now that she is disappeared from the environment and community, does it look like it's going to hell in a handbasket? It hasn't really become internalized self-discipline. That's always a sure sign that it's the teacher that's holding it together, which of course is not the goal of any Montessori classroom.
Absolutely. Let's see, we have a couple other comments. Loving your stories. Emma has to go to dinner, so she'll tune in later. That's Emma every time.
I missed her.
And Olga, let's see, Olga Contreras, I hope I'm saying that correctly. She says, hello, I'm listening to you from Ecuador, where I will be working in a school that is not strictly Montessori, but does have some of the philosophy. I think that what all of you are saying will be easy to apply in the classroom, but there are a couple of things that I need ideas to work around. They do have mixed ages, and they do have subjects teachings as periods. Not sure what that means. They do have lessons to be chosen by the children, and they can work on the lesson they want, but it does have to be within a subject. In all true honesty, they have hired me to help them go truly Montessori. How can I start? That's a great question and a long answer, Olga.
Yeah, Olga, contact the Montessori Foundation. I would love to talk with you about this personally, or Tim could talk with you about this personally. We're happy to support you and give you some ideas. I think, as Kathy said, this would be a rather long and complex answer, but it's a good question, and it's not uncommon with startup schools or schools that are somewhat Montessori inspired, that are sort of merging or overlapping more traditional methods like this is the time for mathematics, or these math lessons, or handwriting. It's a good question. Please contact us so we can support you.
Yeah, and I do think that there's the starting point always is going to be to build relationships with children and get a trusting environment. And you know your Montessori principles and those essentials, and you be an advocate for those children. So, absolutely. Yeah. Let's see, we've got lots of wonderfuls, and we've got a couple people, somebody who's having a little bit of a hard time with audio, so I'll respond to them separately. Meyer Aro says, hi, I've just got to a school as head, and what I see is teachers are worried for academic level and are forgetting about emotions of the children. I want to bring them back, and it's a Spanish word, I think, filosofo, I think the philosophy, yes. And what would you do? And again, I think it's the same kind of thing, but John, I'll let you go ahead and comment on that particular.
I will say it 3 times: grace and courtesy, grace and courtesy, grace and courtesy. And very shortly, we're going to get into what I've learned are all the different types of grace and courtesy activities beyond perhaps what we all received in training. So I'd like to hold off answering your question, and maybe you'll see some strategies for moving teachers back to those soft skills, or the developmental base of character, social and emotional intelligence, self-control. It is the foundation of Montessori and what makes us different. We are a developmental model that leads to academic excellence. So we're going to address that with some actual strategies if we could. Kathy?
Okay, John, we'll get to the next one. I want to welcome Tim. He has shown up on our screen, and I'm sure everyone is happy to see you, Tim, as I am. And we've had a great, lively discussion so far. I'm going to go ahead and advance the next slide for John, so we've got that going.
Tim, welcome. You've already been a case study. You've done a wonderful job with the bank game edition, Tim.
Oh, I'm so pleased.
You didn't know.
As an aside, for Olga and everyone else that's listening, there's something new that's just been launched that I think you all ought to know about.
Okay.
It's something developed by the Center for Guided Montessori Studies, which is the IMC-affiliated teacher education center. It's called the Montessori Library. And I think, if I remember correctly, that the website, if you choose to look at, is montessorilibrary.com. If I'm remembering it incorrectly, contact me at the Montessori Foundation. I'll check it and let you know. But basically, it's they've basically deconstructed existing courses that are MACD certified and set it up so that schools can, if they want to, use it for professional development for people who need a refresher or who can't start training yet but want to begin. It's a lot of video and written resource, and it looks pretty darn good.
Yeah, it's very comprehensive. I really will say that I did go through the library and looked at a lot of the resources, and I was really pleased with how many choices at each level there are to choose from. So
excellent.
I appreciate it on that.
Thanks for the reminder, Tim. So principle 3, before we get into strategies, grace and courtesy entails the development of self-awareness as well as self-control. Let me give an example. I see grace and courtesy lessons at the Children's House level, the 3 to 6 level, that sound something like this. I'm just trying to think of a good example. So, example of if you see children at that level disturbing other children, or not asking if they can touch somebody else's work or work with somebody, the standard presentation is to simply role play, may I work with you, or here's how I'm going to observe. In other words, we're simply presenting the behavior, the ideal behavior. Nothing wrong with that. But I'm wondering whether children need to have some points of interest about self-awareness. If Kathy and I were teaching together, and we had noticed that a number of our 3, 4, and 5-year-olds were tending to just walk up and talk with somebody who is working or begin to touch their materials, I might do a presentation, a grace and courtesy presentation with Kathy that sounds and looks like this. And let's pretend that Kathy is helping me and she has taken something off the shelf. She's my worker. And I say to the children, I want to tell Kathy about my new dog. This weekend, I got a new dog, a Labrador Retriever, a big black Labrador Retriever, and I can't wait to tell my friend Kathy. And I start to walk over toward Kathy, who's actually working with materials in this role play, and I go, but look, children, what do you see Kathy doing? Is she working? Is she concentrating on her work? She is. I notice that she's concentrating on her work. I don't want to disturb her with my dog story. I think I'll wait so she can concentrate and do her work. And then the children actually see me waiting for about a minute or two. And finally, Kathy finishes up what she's doing or takes a little break. And I go again, an awareness question. Children, look, does it look like Kathy has finished that work? Has she finished the binomial cube? I think she has. I think maybe I'll talk with her now about my dog. And I walk over to Kathy, and then you have the grace and courtesy behavior. Kathy, may I tell you about my new dog? And Kathy, who has rehearsed this with me, says, oh, yes, Jonathan, I'd love to hear about your new dog, and thank you for waiting and not interrupting my work. Did you notice the grace and courtesy presentation was not only the behavior, may I tell you about my new dog, but it actually showed the student being aware of an other child's needs. So what I'm suggesting here in this slide, that part of grace and courtesy needs to be helping children notice what's going on within them, how they feel within others in the classroom, and from the basis of those self-aware observations, those metacognitive kind of, oh, I know what I'm thinking, I know what I'm feeling, I know what I'm seeing. Out of that comes the more respectful and responsible behavior, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
All right, let's move on. We're still on the principles. And finally, principle 4 in the realm of grace and courtesy. Celebration must outweigh censure. There is a very interesting piece of research, and I can't attribute it. I've forgotten, but it was done, I believe, in Utah, at Utah State. And the research is basically, if you want a person to maintain a trusting relationship with you, whether it's an adult or, in this case, students, and you also want them to consider learning something new, new thinking, new behavior, new piece of material, to maintain positive relationship and be open to learning, to be receptive to learning, the ratio of positive feedback, and I don't mean good job, things like, Kathy, I noticed that you did that, or boy, are you working hard on that. The ratio of positive feedback to another human being to negative, either no feedback at all or a negative feedback, please, please walk, or please don't run, is 8-to-1. The research shows that the preponderance of transformative communication has to be on the positive feedback side of the equation and not the negative. What does this mean for a Montessori classroom? Take a moment to think about, if you're a classroom teacher or have been, or if you're a school leader with certain staff, think about more challenging children or more challenging staff and ask yourself, has your ratio been 8-to-1, or because of this person's needs for more and more structure and support, this child's need, this adult, am I drifting to, no, Kathy, that's the school's policy, or no, you're going to need to put that work away, or we've talked about using the work that way, and all of that is absolutely necessary. But the idea here of grace and courtesy is there needs to be more appreciation, acknowledgement, encouragement, celebration than the negatives. Montessori had 2 phrases about this that many of you may have heard in training: teach teaching, not correcting. And the Montessori teacher is looking for the child who is not yet there. We identify children's needs and tendencies, and we're honest about that. But we also envision, what is the next step in Tim's normalization? What does he look like using his words? What does he look like being more careful with this material? The phrase I like to use with parents when I try to get this idea of positive parenting, or parenting toward the potential and not the problem, is in Montessori, with regard to behavior development and behavior management, we focus the child more on the behavior objective than on the objectionable behavior. So again, keep in mind as you work through grace and courtesy at the beginning of the year and through the year, is it based on positive feedback, thanking children for their effort, thanking them for helping keep the playground safe, helping them help other children continue to work because they were talking less. Thank you so much for helping, as opposed to, you're doing this and this is going to happen. And we need to give children consequences. We're talking about the ratio here. It's got to be more positive and forward thinking than backward thinking and problem oriented, if that makes sense. Any thoughts coming through, Kathy, before we actually look at strategies?
Not yet. We do have a request for Tim to tell us the Montessori library. I did put a private message back because I think you go through guidedstudies.com. Is that correct, Tim?
I think Tim might have gone off to do other things.
Oh, okay, I don't have the camera on, so I couldn't see. All right, well, it is guidedstudies.com. Sorry for the commercial break there, but let's go ahead to the to the next slide here. Okay.
Yeah, just before we get there, I just want to say I'm in Florida working with Tim on all sorts of new online courses for about a month and a half. Tim has so many balls in the air that are doing good for Montessori that when he leaves, he is not leaving because he doesn't want to be here. He is running a high school that's opening, actually a large school that runs from toddler through high school, the Newgate School. He's got all sorts of responsibilities with the Montessori Foundation in addition to course development like this. So we're all patient with Tim because we know he juggles a lot of balls for Montessori goodness, and he will be here when he can.
Absolutely. So, we appreciate you being here today, John, so that helps.
Feeling is mutual. Always good working with you. So let's do a quick reprise of the tomato parable, and I've already mentioned this, but I just want to reinforce it. As in tending a garden, the cultivation of social norms, grace and courtesy agreements, and again, whether these are strict role plays with younger children or role plays, simulations, and community discussions with older children, this does not conclude at the end of September. It is a continuous process of shaping and pruning students' social awareness and skills. Notice social awareness and skills. A learning experience that must be presented in practice over the course of the entire school year. So I have a little idea of a strategy that I've seen some teachers engage in to keep themselves disciplined for the need to keep cultivating the garden of grace and courtesy. And here's the strategy. It's an observational strategy. Ask yourself, if you are a Montessori guide or if you are the instructional leader of a Montessori guide, whether your teachers or you have the bandwidth to do this. Once a week, at a designated time, unless there happens to be arterial bleeding in the classroom or flames, at a designated time, 9:30 on Thursday, I am going to observe for 5 to 10 minutes just for grace and courtesy behaviors, which of course are twofold. Physical movement, small muscle, how children are working with their hands, but also large muscle, body coordination and awareness, but also social, interpersonal, language skills in terms of working in a community. All I'm going to do is focus my attention on how are the children speaking to themselves, and teachers, how are they moving about the classroom. And invariably, if you focus the aperture of the camera of your mind, you are going to start to see little nuances, like children noticing that other children have not set work up properly, but they're going up with that awareness and going, "That's not the way you do it, Kathy. I'm going to tell Mr. Selden." It's like, no. You'll start to make notes of things that can be refined and nuanced if teachers discipline themselves to just take a moment and focus on grace and courtesy. Take that list once a week and prioritize it. Okay, of the 6 things I saw, or whatever number, what is going to have the most transformative effect on the learning community along 2 parameters? What will increase the level of independent, self-directed engagement in learning with the Montessori materials? And 2, what will create a collaborative culture of respect for people who are learning and support of people who are learning? So you put your top ones on the top of the list, and the ones that are maybe less critical at the moment down low, and then you start to chip away, one at a time, presenting probably only 1 or 2 every day. And I would suggest, since we ask children to only take 1 piece of material off the shelf at a time, focus on 1 behavior with grace and courtesy lessons, activities, discussions, until you begin to see the behaviors growing in the garden of your classroom, and then you can move on to something else. But if you observe every week for refinements, you will keep tending and cultivating the garden, and behavior will improve. But teachers have to have the discipline of focused observation, prioritization, and daily follow-through with imaginative activities. That makes sense.
It does indeed. We have a comment here from Olga. I like the positive reinforcement. It is our duty to really help other adults feel that way and make sure that we pay attention to ourselves for this practice. Right. And I think that's so important. So we're talking about it in relation to children, but of course we are also talking about it in relation to adults. We're no different in that respect, in that if we, only hear negative feedback, pretty soon we just stop trying.
We do.
And so we see that with staff as well.
Yeah, Olga, thank you. Yeah, good reminder. I just want to piggyback on that for a moment. As you know, in the ideal sense philosophically, we are not into praise in Montessori. We want to have children ultimately develop into self-assessing and self-aware human beings, as in assessment of their worth as a person. I'm a good person and I'm a capable person. Isn't that what we want for all Montessori students leading into adulthood? And 2, they can also assess their work. Here's what I did well today. Here was my best effort. Here are some things that I can do better. Here's my goal for tomorrow. So if you agree that the ultimate goal is self-assessment leading to self-regulation and self-discipline, keep in mind, if you're a purist Montessorian, who is like, we never give children praise, there is a tendency to forget some children are not at the top of the mountain of self-assessment and self-esteem. You know that there are children in every Montessori classroom, and for that matter, teachers and parents in every school, who are struggling in certain areas of life and learning to feel confident and to feel competent. Yes? I'm sure you can think about children who that child is really struggling, feeling good about this and themselves in this area, and they really have not developed those concepts or skills. When somebody is climbing Mount Everest being the summit, being, you know, complete self-assessment, being self-aware, self-assessing, when they're climbing Mount Everest and they're struggling and they're making the effort or they're making progress, don't these children and these adults need some feedback? I noticed that you got from base camp 1 to base camp 2 on Mount Everest. I know you didn't get to base camp 2, but boy, were you working hard to get over that ice field. You know, thank you for your effort. Thank you for support of your team. So I would caution you, if you are a long-standing Montessorian or if you've had the impression that we never give Montessori children or Montessori adults positive feedback, it's erroneous, because in following the child, or in this case following the adult if you're a leader, people who need feedback should get feedback in a way that's, again, not good job. All right. Let's push on to some actual strategies, unless there's anybody who has something to share or something to ask, Kathy.
Well, there's a question here. Let's see, this is Sherry asking, and it may come up in the strategies, but I'll go ahead and read the question so you can keep it in mind. I want to help with transitioning kindergartners who are moving on to public school for first grade. Do I become more of a teacher than a facilitator at some point during the year?
That's a great question. This is one of my hot buttons. I find Montessori schools, when children are in transition, and this could be transition to the next program level, which has may have a whole different culture between 3 to 6 and 6 to 9, et cetera, but it is certainly true moving from a Montessori model to a traditional model. I see schools and teachers going to two extremes. Either we're pure Montessori, we're not going to talk to children about bullies, testing, grades, sitting in a chair or a desk and never being able to move. We're simply not going to do it because we're pure Montessori. It's like, oh, okay, and now you're going to have a culture shock child and a culture shock family. And then there's schools that go in the other direction. For the last 6 weeks or 3 weeks of school, we're going to be doing lots of testing. We're going to be grading things. You know, we're going to be, in other words, it can really compromise. If you go too far, it can actually compromise the Montessori model. I believe we have a responsibility, if a child is moving to another program level or to another school, a traditional school, to give them a guided sneak preview that is very transparent. Let's talk about, we'll see a film, we'll go observe, we'll have a community meeting. Let's talk about things that happen in public junior high school that's different than our middle school, or public high school that's different than our middle school. What can you expect? And there are a million strategies for this. You can have a public school, high school graduate or a high school student come in and talk to the students. You could do an observation. You could show a film. You could do a little practice and taking a quiz. Or, okay, let's just practice sitting in desks for an hour and doing our work. It's the idea of an orientation, but that doesn't compromise the basic Montessori model of self-directed learning, but it also is not pure denial that we never look at this in Montessori. It's like, well, now the poor child is going to be in a planet that they're not familiar with. So I think it's a balance, and I think it's a purposeful orientation that's actually thought out as a Montessori exercise. How are we going to present this in a positive way where children can discuss this, explore this, and get a sneak preview that neither scares them but also gives them enough information to know, okay, this is the planet I'm going to be visiting next.
Yeah, it also respects the integrity of the Montessori program without, you know, totally throwing that to the wind.
Exactly.
To do it.
All right.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
let's get into strategies for our last 35, 40 minutes. So there's a big toolbox, I think, of Montessori grace and courtesy lessons, exercises, and social norms, and only a few of these did I learn in pre-service training. And this is not any criticism of Mother Isabel's course or any of your trainings. I just think we need, in the spirit of Montessori being an experimental scientist, to broaden our view of all the forms that grace and courtesy can take so that children can have a very robust and wide spectrum experience of, here's some alternative behaviors that serve everybody's learning and serve everybody's relationships. So, first one, Kathy, please. All right. Once upon a line, not once upon a time, once upon a line if you're an early childhood teacher. I know we don't use line in the elementary, but I learned, you know, the circle is sometimes called the line. So once upon a line, it's all about storytelling, and I can't say enough about storytelling. There are essentially 4 types of storytelling. I demonstrated one this morning with the 3 Roses story, which is an object lesson where you create based on a certain quality of behavior, quality of character, moral value. You create a story using an object. I'd like to give an elementary example. I gave an early child example with the three wild roses. I was doing a consultation at a public Montessori school in the inner city of San Diego. And the children, these 6 to 9-year-olds, were being pretty disrespectful and rather aggressive with one another, both physically aggressive, emotionally disrespectful, and fairly, you know, rough language. And children were getting their feelings hurt, children were getting angry, there was a lot of frustration. And the teacher tried to do all sorts of language lessons and community meetings on, you know, kind language, loving language, and some of it was taking, but the garden really wasn't growing. So I came in one day as simply an instructional modeler for the teacher with 3 sets of apples. And you'll need to picture these. I didn't bring my objects with me. I was not prepared. So I said, children, this is one apple family here. And the apples, by the way, were 3 sets of apples, different colors, 3 green, 3 red. You see, the green family, they're a family of apples, and sometimes they did not agree with one another. Sometimes they hurt each other's feelings by saying something. Sometimes one of them wanted to do this, and one of them wanted to do that, and they would get into arguments because they had different needs and feelings, and when they started to argue, this is what it looked like. I said we're going to do it this way, and I said and I just was smashing the apples together. Well, you know, I mimicked fighting apples. Listen, we're going to do it this way. No, we're not. I'm going to tell Mom. And after I did that, and I really smashed them hard, I passed the apples around and I asked the children, what do you feel? What do the apples feel like? Children were very articulate. Oh, they're broken, they're bruised, they're all busted up inside. Really? And then I took the second set of apples. I said, this red family, they're the same as the green family of apples. They don't always agree. Sometimes feelings are hurt. Sometimes they're frustrated and they're angry with each other because they want to do different things, or somebody didn't include somebody in a game. And here's what they do when they're really upset. We need to talk about this because this is how I felt when this happened, and I'm really going to ask you to do this. Well, I need you to do this. You know, you're never letting me, you know, play in that game, and I really need your help with this. So I modeled non-violent problem solving and conflict resolution. At the end of that modeling, I passed the apples around. I said, children, what do you feel about these apples? Well, these apples are still hard. They're okay. Oh, they're not broken? No, they're not broken like the other apples. So children, I have a question for you. What kind of an apple family do you want to have in this classroom? The first family or the second family? And that became a base for having children remind each other and the teachers reminding them. It's like, so today, what kind of an apple family are we going to be, and what does that behavior look like? Let's role play some of these language behaviors. And at the end of the day, there was a little debriefing. So which apple family were we? Did anybody see anybody being the red apple and they want to thank them? So again, an object lesson metaphor. Storytelling type 2, a parable, a fairy tale. You all know what those are. If you need some ideas and you don't want to make them up, go to any large bookstore and go to the folk tale section of the bookstore. You will find endless examples of moral-based stories. My only caveat is don't make them horrendously scary for any age group. Don't make them so fantastic that they look like something out of you know, something on cable television or some of the stuff that's out in the movies now. It should not be overly violent. It can have some aggression. Make sure the stories have a solution, and make them as imaginative as possible. The other thing that I'll mention about parables that you might gather from forms of literature, which is more powerful to a child? What's more engaging and more motivating, a read story or a orally told story? It's a rhetorical question. I'm sure you know my answer. Reading a story is great, but telling the story with your own energy and your own words gives it so much more power. You can also be much more attentive to the audience. You can ask questions, you can notice children's faces, you can slow the story down, you can get them involved. I strongly encourage you, when it comes to storytelling, have it be storytelling, and whenever possible, not story reading. And I'm not knocking good literature here. Storytelling type 3 is stories of real people and human nobility, human compassion, sound character. Quick example. I think I might have mentioned this in a recent webinar. There was a Special Olympics in Seattle. And I actually told this story to a group of 6 to 9-year-olds who were incredibly competitive, almost at a cutthroat level. You know, they were competitive, but they were bordering on poor sportsmanship and putting people down. Like, well, you couldn't do that, and my team could do that. So this Special Olympics was a national Special Olympics with children who had different exceptionalities, mental exceptionalities, physical exceptionalities, speech exceptionalities, and the race was the 100-yard dash for children 9 through 13 years old. And the gun went off, and these 10 children began to run, except for one little boy who fell down at the starting line, and because he had some problems with his legs, he couldn't get up. And he started to cry loudly. The other 9 runners were halfway down the course, about 50 yards down the course, and they heard this boy crying, and every single one of the other children stopped. They turned around, they saw him, they all walked back together, picked this boy off the ground, and linked arms as a team and walked to the finish line all as winners. The adults, the parents and teachers in the stands either erupted in applause or just started to weep. Like, isn't this the way the world should be? So I told that story to a group of 6 to 9-year-old very competitive kids, and I asked them some questions. Why didn't they go for the gold? Why did they go back for their friend? What were they thinking? You know? And what's best for this classroom? It's like, would anybody ever do that? Just to raise their consciousness that there's something even of a higher order than cutthroat, personal, ego-driven competition. So again, an example of a real story of real people. Last storytelling type. If you start a story with a group of students of any age, when you're addressing a particular behavior, social, emotional issue, even a work-related issue, could I tell you something that happened to me when I was a child? Or can I tell you something that happened to me last week with my computer or my car? The minute you say, can I tell you something that happened to me, especially if it's when you were a child, their pupils dilate. It's like, you were a child? You get their attention immediately. Telling them your story and how you solved it, your moral, emotional, social dilemma, it's very powerful. Object lessons, parables, stories of real human endeavor, and personal tales, all of which deal with a particular quality of character or behavior that you want. Very, very powerful. If there's ways, after you tell the story, of having follow-up experiences, leaving the objects in the classroom, which we did with the apples, having felt boards, finger puppets, letting kids act it out and film it or record it. So it can become, if they're engaged in the story and you want it to have a profound effect upon their behavior, then you need to move it to the second period of the Montessori lesson, which is practice on their own terms. So it's okay for the teacher to jumpstart the story on this quality of behavior or character, but then it should ultimately in some way be an off-the-shelf student-directed activity so they can reinforce it. So those are the 4 storytelling types. Any questions or thoughts on what we've covered thus far or storytelling?
We just have a comment that Michelle loves the idea of bringing in an alumni to speak with transitioning students, referring to our earlier conversation.
Yeah.
So again, just lots of great ideas, and people are really appreciating that. So I think we're ready to move on to the next slide.
I appreciate that comment, and I just want to piggyback on that for a moment. Not only are graduates, alumni, great to talk to students about either what happens at the next program level. I mean, you can have students at the next program level talk to early childhood or children's house children about what they're going to experience, but alumni who've actually graduated can not only talk to students about what they're going to experience in high school, public high school, they can also talk to the parents, which really impresses the parents because these are articulate individuals usually. All right, moving on to another strategy. Reflective role-playing. Before I take you through the steps here, I'll tell you a story, and again, I beg your forgiveness if some of you have heard this before, but this was a very powerful experience for me. I had a group of children in the same class that was socially schizophrenic. That needed the Rose story. There were a group of children who were inveterate whiners. Am I correct in assuming you have or have had some children who are inveterate whiners? I can't do this. I want to put it back on the shelf. It's like, okay. And usually with these 3- and 4-year-olds who were whiners, it was something to do with their clothing or something of a practical life nature. I can't button this. I can't put my coat on. It's like, get a life. So one morning out of sheer frustration, I came in, and this was my presentation. I first of all had one of my shoes, or both of my shoes, untied. And I said, children, let's for a moment pretend that I'm about 3 years old, and I have not learned to tie my own shoes, and as you can see, my shoe is untied. I wonder how I can get my shoe tied and solve my shoe tying problem. Well, here's something I can do, and so I reached down and was fumbling with the shoelace and starting to have a little hissy fit meltdown. I can't do this! I mimicked whining. And then I stopped and got really serious, and I said, children, I have 2 questions for you. How am I feeling? And the children said, oh, really sad, really upset, Mr. Wolff. Is my shoe tied? It's not, you're right. What else can I do? I then I then stood up and I said, I'm not going outside today. I'm going to stay inside, so I don't need to tie my shoe. At which point, I literally tripped on my shoelace and fell down on my face. I pantomimed tripping on a shoelace. And then I started to cry. I asked the same 2 reflective questions. So how am I feeling now, children? Is my shoe tied? You're feeling hurt, and your shoe's not tied, Mr. Wolff. I then selected a 5-year-old. My friend, Kathy Leach, is 5, and she knows how to tie shoes. I've seen her. Kathy, could you help me tie my shoe? Could you tie it for me? And Kathy, this 5-year-old, sort of puffs up and goes, come over here, Mr. Wolff. I'll help you. Child tied my shoes. I asked the same 2 questions. How am I feeling now? Oh, much better, Mr. Wolff. Is my shoe tied? But I wasn't going to leave it there because I'm now dependent upon Kathy. So I said, my good friend Kathy ties my shoes every single day, and one day she goes on vacation. Maybe she went to Disneyland or something, but I don't know where she went, and my shoe's untied. Now what am I going to do? I wanted to learn to tie my own shoe, and I had a child or my co-teacher assistant bring me the bow frame, and I had this person, child or adult, give me a formal lesson, and then they saw me working it through. I did the first part, and I said, I need another lesson. So I showed real persistence in wanting to learn this. So this child or teacher gave me about 3 presentations, and then finally I tied my shoe. By that time, the children had forgotten I'm an adult, and so they stood up and applauded and went, Mr. Wolff, good job, good job. And I said, now children, same questions. How am I feeling? Really good. Is my shoe tied? It is. Who's going to tie my shoe tomorrow? You will. How am I going to feel? Really good. So as you can see the steps in this reflective role play process, enact out each behavior response option, This could be dealing with works, a challenging issue with work, like a child who quits too prematurely or who starts getting frustrated and having a tantrum about work. It can be a social situation, whether it's sharing or aggression. You enact each possible behavior response, you role play it, and with older children, they can role play. Well, anybody want to role play another way we can handle this? But with early childhood, I would suggest the teacher does this. 2, after the enactment of each option, pose 2 questions. How do you think they were feeling? Did they get what they wanted? Did they reach their goal? 3, enact the most respectful and responsible behavior option last. You want to leave them with the quote-unquote right choice. Some of you may be thinking, do we really want to present negative behaviors to children? My answer to that is, if you know your class and you know you have some kids who are attention getters and low on impulse control, and they're actually going to focus more on the negatives, you know, the whining, the screaming, whatever it is, then don't do the negative alternatives. I think it's really powerful in terms of developing student awareness and purposeful decision making to have students in a very guided way see all the different ways you can make a choice or make a decision in something that is emotionally, socially, physically, academically challenging, with the following reflections. So how did that make you feel, or how did it make your friends feel, and were you able to complete the activity or get what you wanted? So I think if character development and social development is helping children understand life is about choices, and each choice creates a certain consequence emotionally and in the environment, so to speak, then I think children generally need to see their options, unless you've got children who will misuse it. So that's.
Well, I also think, Jonathan, that if children know their options. They know that they have the choice to do something that's not appropriate, or that reflects their lack of control or self-regulation. They have that choice, and if we pretend they don't, it's sort of insulting to them that that really is a choice.
Well, thank you for bringing that up, Kathy. Isn't that the difference between kind of presenting grace and courtesy? Is these are the ground rules, and here's how you're supposed to behave. And yeah, these are the ground rules. But if you present it with these are the rules, as opposed to look at all the different ways a human being could respond, which one produces the best feeling, the most peace, the most learning, the best relationships? I think when we have children observe and make a free choice about this is a better behavior, it's much more powerful than this is the teacher's or classroom's rules. So I really support what you said.
Yeah. So we have a couple of questions. Natalie Bahinsky says, storytelling for toddlers, same or tweaked?
And I'm not an expert in toddler education, but in case people are thinking about how much fantasy, like with parables or object lessons, do we bring in, let me ask a question before I address that question. It was Natalie, did you say?
Yes.
Natalie. Before I address your question, Natalie, in general, does a 3-year-old child know that roses don't talk? Most people would say, yeah, 3-year-olds have had enough sensory experience with the environment that they know that roses don't actually talk. It's not going to confuse them. A 2-year-old?
Right.
Maybe not. Maybe we don't want to go to that level of personified fantasy with a 2-year-old. Maybe it needs to be a little bit more concrete. So that would be one answer. I would keep the stories with 2-year-olds very, very simple, very concrete. Kathy, you are the director of CGMS's toddler program. Would you address this, please?
Sure. Well, I definitely believe, agree with what you say. It's going to be a lot more concrete, and it's going to be very, very brief. So one of the biggest mistakes we make with toddlers is that we overtalk, and so they've lost us, long ago, because they're moved on to something else. And so we're not all that interesting unless we actually make it interesting. So I would say short. We can use some of the things, but they're not cognitively at a point where they're going to do the comparison to the object lesson. So I think that they love storytelling, and we are just very, very brief about it and not too moralistic about it, because they're just not, it's just not there yet. But they
Kathy,
do love stories.
thank you for doing the moralistic thing. In case you're thinking, at what point should I ask as a Montessori guide or parent, what's the moral of the story? When I would go to schools and model these kinds of character education stories, these social intelligence stories, it was kind of magical. At about 8 years old, invariably in the lower elementary, somewhere between 7 and 8, usually 8, the children go, at the end of this fantastical story, what's the moral of that? What does that mean, Mr. Wolff? Before they ask what the moral is, they're not at that level of abstract thinking. Simply leave them with the metaphor, kind of like the 3 roses. It will get into their consciousness. It will get into their souls. Kathy,
absolutely. And there's none of that's going to be through repetition of the story and the circumstances.
Kathy, I wanted to ask you one other question in response to Natalie's question. Does a teacher of a toddler age child also need to be attentive to pace of speech and space between speech? In other words, should there be moments of silence rather than a quick pace without any breaks to have children process? Am I onto something here?
You're definitely onto something. So, as I said, we tend to use too many words, and we tend to speak fairly quickly. And toddlers need time to process, and they need time to respond. And so we use a few words at a time. We kind of are, watching for the cues, because so much of the toddler communication is nonverbal, and so we have to really be tuned into that and then pace accordingly, and just not so many words and not so much content, if you will.
Thank you. Okay. Anything else before we push on, Kathy?
Yeah, we have a question here, which I know you can answer. Is there a story in your collection in regards to third-year modeling that can be shared?
Yeah, I think if you know of somebody that has the Self-Awakened Child character education series that I developed, I think there are several metaphors in that series. These are 15 different qualities of character, all of which have stories and role plays embedded in them. I think there is something on older student mentoring in those stories. I can't recall specifically what it is, but I think there is.
I know for sure there is, yeah. And it's a really great series. I would certainly encourage people to consider it. Okay, so let's see. We also have Michelle Jesse asks, remind me of the 4 types of stories, please. So I know you have that. Yeah, so if you can go through those.
I should have made a slide on this. It occurred to me later. Object lessons, that there's a physical object like the 3 roses or the apples. Parables, simply metaphorical stories, fairy tales, parables, metaphors that are not, in physical reality. Stories of real human beings and what they can do. And by the way, the best resource for that is Chicken Soup for the Soul that I found, many books. And by the way, it doesn't need to be the children's Chicken Soup. Children love the adult stories in Chicken Soup for the Soul. And then finally, personal tales of things that you've been through that are moral, social, emotional dilemmas, and how you felt and negotiated and solved it. So those are the 4 storytelling type. I think we need to push on, Kathy.
All righty. Let's see. There we go.
This one is decidedly more second plane of development, although I would use what you're about to hear in a very simple way with even my 4 or 5-year-olds, sometimes even 3-year-olds. Help students set behavior improvement goals, both individual and group. Frame goals in the positive. Focus students' attention on the behavior objective, not the objectionable behavior. Again, that could be language like, so with regard to our work time today and how we're going to help each other really focus in and complete our best effort work, what are we going to try to do with our language, our talking today? So it's creating a framework in context of something that an individual or a group of students can shoot for. At the beginning of each day, each week, or even each work period, guide students to set specific, observable behavior improvement goals. Again, this can be group, this can be individual. I'll give an example. So let's pretend, I'm going to use Tim, since he now disappeared again, as an example. Let's pretend that little Tim, who's a 2 or 3-year-old, is still working on using his words to express his feelings and needs, and he's tending to do the pushing thing. And we've discussed it. We've had grace and courtesy lessons on it with the 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. Just before Tim goes outside to play, or in the outdoor environment, I pull Tim aside and go, Tim, today, if somebody takes a ball away from you or says something that hurts your feelings, are you going to try to tell them what you want them to do with your words, or are you going to try to use your hands? Are you going to use words or hands today? In most cases, the child gets it. I'm going to try to use words. The response then becomes, thank you for using words. It's going to keep our playground really safe and peaceful. Thank you for helping. Within a few moments of the play period or the work period, I'm going to go up to Tim and go, I've noticed you using your words. Thank you for helping keep our playground or our work environment safe and peaceful. So rapid reinforcement. Number 3, debrief. And again, this would be with older students. Debrief the results at the conclusion of the day, week, work period, or at the end of an activity or even an event, a going out or field trip. Celebrate progress first. Invite observations and requests afterward. Did anybody see anybody doing anything this morning that helped somebody focus in on their work and not be distracted by talking? Does anybody want to say thank you to somebody? And the teacher can do that. I saw Kathy sitting at her table doing her work, and she didn't talk to Tim once in a half an hour. Thank you, Kathy. We can also talk about, can we improve? And would you like to make a request of everybody? Tim, please don't talk with me when I'm working because it really distracted me. So there is a debriefing and then a goal setting in the next period, next day, a debriefing, positive reinforcement. So it's all teaching, not correcting. This is another wonderful form of grace and courtesy. I'm going to accelerate things a little bit, Kathy, because I want to get a few more things in and not hold people up, but we'll still take time for questions. A companion to the last one, and again, this is definitely second and third plane of development, 6 to 12, 12 to 18 months, 12 to 18 years, still back in toddler education, Kathy. Conduct community problem-solving meetings, and I'm going to suggest some language frameworks here. Let's say there had been an issue on the going out, on the field trip, or in the outdoor environment, or working on the project for the seasonal theater production. What did you see, hear, feel when this happened? Inviting students to simply share their stories. 2, what are you feeling now about what happened? So that's post-evaluation of feeling as opposed to what did you see, feel when it happened. What would you like to see happen? What would you like to hear and feel in this situation? And then how can we make this happen? What are the strategies? And I added one that I frankly forgot, if you want to jot it down. After how can we make it happen, now we've got the personal responsibility question. What are your personal responsibilities to make this happen? What can you do better, and can I do better to make that, how we can make this happen? Like if we want people to be more respectful of each other when people are working, then what is the behavior that I need to do for myself and for my friends? So the 5th one is, what are your personal responsibilities? And you notice the note, don't ask, why did this happen? It leads to blaming. This is solid research. It's true of management and employees. If a person knew why they did it, they probably wouldn't do it. So asking why only creates guilt, shame, and blame. Don't go there. Have people tell their stories, and in the storytelling, you usually see the cause and effect of when this happened, then this happened, and this person felt this. It shows the why in the storytelling in 1 and 2, or in 1, and then you want to retell the story. Well, how could we have a different outcome? One of the techniques, and I think I mentioned it in our last webcast, that I have started to suggest to teachers with regard to this process, set it up like a movie shoot. So what does a director do? He directs the actors, and if they don't like the scene that they shot, didn't come off well, what do? Yeah, they reshoot it. So if you don't like the scene that was shot yesterday on the field trip, let's be the directors and do a reshoot and see if it looks like a happier ending or better for everybody. Okay.
Okay. Yep.
Another powerful technique for sort of toning children's consciousness toward better, more responsible, respectful behavior is practice affirmations. This can be poetry. This can be something that's repeated. This is one of the ones from the book on peace of the character education series that I developed for 3 to 9-year-olds called The Self-Awakened Child. And I wish we had time to actually have you do this, but I'm going to demonstrate this really quickly, and this comes from a meditative discipline. I'll do simply that first stanza there. Loud voice, waveless sea, deep still water, this is me, deep still water, this is me. Let's do it in a softer voice, children. Waveless sea, deep still water, this is me, deep still water, this is me. Waveless sea, deep still water, this is me, deep still water, this is me, in a whisper, see, etc. And then after the whisper, it goes to simply mouthing it. And for older students, meaning over 6 or 7, now we're just going to say it mentally. Once you take the children through that process, it is not only reinforce the concepts, but it ends in kind of a nice period of stillness or silence. I think it's a form of the silence game, another spin-off. Guided imagery, taking children through a guided imagery of something like, again, I won't take your time because I do want to take a few more questions and we're getting close here, but just having children close their eyes after they relax their bodies, take a few deep breaths, and picture a beautiful, what you see here, picture a beautiful, waveless, glassy, mirror-like lake among the mountains, see the sky, feel the air, and then take the lake into your heart or into your mind and feel that that lake is going to be inside you for the whole day. I know teachers who do a visualization of what the perfect work period is going to look like and what their interactions and the children's self-directed behavior look like before children arrive. Blueprinting visually, especially for the more visual learners, is a very powerful tool in refining and altering behavior.
Whoops, I think I skipped one. There we go.
This is one that I learned after my training. Personal challenge and team building games. I'll give 2 real quick examples. In the same classroom in Philadelphia, or maybe my next year in the 3 to 6-year-olds, I had a group of children who just were not aware of themselves in space. They would, bump into each other and walk across each other's work rugs. So I put the whole group, about 15 or 20 of them, in a circle. And I told them, these are 3 to 6-year-olds. You can make this more sophisticated for older children. I told them, take a look across the room and look at something on the wall that you can see with your eyes. It can be a picture, it can be a lamp, it can be a window. What do you see? Do you see it? Now, put your hands behind your back and very slowly walk in a straight line. You can't go this way and you can't go this way. Walk to what you see. Well, of course, what they did is they had total gridlock. They all came together in the middle because I asked them to walk in a straight line. I had them go back, and I said, this time you can walk in circles and you can walk in curves, but you can't touch anybody's body and you can't talk. Put your hands behind your back and walk to your spot without touching anybody's body. And so now they're kind of going, it was just an exercise in being aware, a physical team building exercise. Okay. If you Google team games or low ropes games on the internet, you'll get all sorts of personal challenge team building games that again build grace and courtesy skills, but in a rather physical way. Okay? One of my favorite quotes by William Blake, a truth that's told with bad intent beats all the lies you can invent. One of the steps in a community meeting to solve a problem or to come up with some new behavior agreements for more respect, responsibility, teachers often forget to ask the question after the new agreements and behavior have been formed. This is what we're all going to try to do. The teacher forgets to ask the accountability and advocacy question. So if I see one of my friends, or you see one of your friends forgetting to do some of our agreements, how can we help them kindly and respectfully? What language can we use? So it's actually practicing how to offer support as a student to a student in a way that's kind and respectful. So as Kathy brought up earlier, the support and the enforcement of new behavior agreements, it does not default to the teacher, it defaults to the students, which is where it should belong. Okay. I'm only going to say quickly one thing about this, because again, I don't want to keep people too much longer. I'm convinced that the next iteration of practical life at all levels is helping children become aware of and manage their neurological, emotional, and physical energies. I see inordinate numbers of Montessori guides at all program levels, sheep-dogging children back to work. Kathy, your work is over here. What are you doing over here? Tim, how come you're over here? Your work is over here. So we're guiding children to be re-engaged, primarily because the child has lost focus, concentration, has become restless. Isn't a life skill we want for these children when they become adults is to regulate their own stress, their own personal energy. I imagine most of you were saying, We need more off-the-shelf mind-body activities that are presented in a manner where when my body feels this way, children, or my emotions feel this way, here's something I like to do. And then we go over and demonstrate a finger labyrinth, demonstrate a musical listening station. There are a variety of things that children can do to reboot themselves that should be off-the-shelf activities. Let me give a very rapid example. I don't know if he's still teaching, but Scott Dagler at Ithaca Montessori School, 6 to 9 teacher, lower elementary. Scott was into Buddhist meditation and Tai Chi. He developed a series of 6 beautiful semi-precious stones. He would put them on the left side of a mat. He would sit down and just do this. He wouldn't tell the children what he was doing. And this is what he would do with each stone, starting at the bottom. He'd, in slow motion, bring each stone in an arc over to the other side. It was like Tai Chi of the hand, and then he'd bring them back, and then he'd put it away. The more physical kinesthetic learners started to do that when they just needed to sort of reboot their brains, and it really worked. It was a mind-body activity for becoming aware and rebooting your energy. Kathy? This is about a culture of appreciation. I addressed this a little bit with positive feedback, but ask yourself, as you look at these different expressions of valuing and appreciation, how often does this occur in your school, in your classrooms, among the staff, among the parents? I'm going to start with the bottom. The most obvious one is I celebrate and recognize your accomplishment. I saw you were able to do this by yourself today. I'm so happy for you. How about I celebrate your progress? Sometimes we don't give other human beings, and in this case we're talking about children, we don't give them enough feedback about the progress they made from the beginning of the year, from last week, and we certainly don't recognize effort. I know how hard you're trying to use your words, Tim, and not your hands, and I really appreciate your efforts. How about the 2 subtler ones? I'm really happy you're in my life and in our classroom. What if we went up to certain children, maybe even the ones that we really struggle with, who struggle in behavior, and said, you know, I'm really happy you're in our classroom, even if at times you're not. And then a very powerful one is telling children or adults what you really value about their personality. I love your sense of humor. I love how you're always willing to help somebody. We need to cement and to focus positive behavior. We need more gratitude in our classrooms and in our schools. And then lastly, many of you are familiar with this. I'm not even going to go through these, but if you Google emotional intelligence, Daniel Goleman's work, there are all sorts of things that we can help children do to develop this ability to recognize, manage, and harness emotions for problem solving and building relationships. The 2 techniques for developing this are teachers sharing what they're feeling in an appropriate way without shaming or punitive tone, and asking children lots of questions. Well, I know this is a study of culture and history, What do you think those people in that country were feeling when those other people attacked them? What would you have been feeling? Asking questions about feelings and sharing. So hopefully these were some practical ideas for continuing to rinse and massage different aspects of behavior early in the year and throughout the year based on your observations of what your classroom and your children need. Any questions or thoughts? I know I throw a lot at you there. I apologize.
Not seeing anything new come in. I see that Laura Erickson has asked about sending you that last slide. And Laura, if you're still online, I don't know what slide you had in mind, but one of the things that we will do is you have the PDF of Jonathan's presentation. So within that PDF would be that last, whatever slide you have in mind. I also want to remind everyone that recordings of the webcast, plus typically the PDFs of the presentations, are stored in the IMC members library. So if your school is a member of the International Montessori Council, IMC, or if you are an individual member, you should have access to them. One last thing is I want to let everyone know we are about to switch Montessori.org, which is the home of the Montessori Foundation, the International Montessori Council, and the Montessori Family Alliance, from the old website to a new one. And during the process, if you find that your login doesn't work, you may have to set your password, or just reach out to us. Either send an email to info@montessori.org or to me personally, and we'll straighten it out for you. John, any last words from you?
Yeah, a couple things. If you would care to take this topic in further depth, what we talked about, not only would Tim and I be happy to do a webcast in-service for your teachers or on-site if you're interested. Also, last year for Trillium Montessori CME's group, I did a more expanded version of this called Jumpstart Normalization Early and Often. I believe it's a recording that is purchasable. If you contact Trillium Montessori, I think you might want to gather some more information about that. It's an excellent resource. And then just a reminder, starting at 7 tonight Eastern Daylight Time, Tim and I will be hosting a 3-session course called What Are Your School's New Year's Resolutions Helping Teachers Set Practice and People Improvement Goals and Program Improvement Goals. It's getting the year started with goal setting, fun goal setting for teachers, teaching teams, and the staff as a whole. We'd love for you to join us. It starts at 7 and it will be followed in the next 2 Wednesdays after that. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, John. It was a marvelous presentation. Kathy, what's up next week?
Hi, that's a great question. I think next week I believe that Michael Dorr is back and had some ideas for getting the school year off to a good start and some real practical things.
I hope
is that for next week?
I'm not sure if it is. I got an email this morning from Michael saying that he is traveling, and it sounds like he is tied up for the next few weeks. So we'll have to reach out to him and see what it is.